What if a single year quietly changed the direction of an entire country, and most people never noticed? That question sounds unusual at first. It might even sound like the beginning of a conspiracy theory. But it is not being asked here as a provocation. It is being asked because the historical record from one specific year genuinely raises it. The year is 1913, and the more carefully you examine what happened during those 12 months, the harder it becomes to look away. Most people, when they think about early 20th century American history, skip past 1913 almost entirely. It sits in an uncomfortable position in the timeline, after the progressive political energy of the early 1900s, but before the enormous disruption of the First World War. The war, which began in 1914, tends to pull all the attention toward it. Everything before it becomes background, a quiet period before the storm. And so 1913 is rarely examined on its own terms. But that assumption, that it was simply a quiet year, does not hold up when the actual legislative record is reviewed. Within those 12 months, 3 separate and significant changes were made to the structure of American life. Not minor adjustments, not small corrections. 3 foundational systems were either created or fundamentally altered. The first was the national money supply, specifically, how it was controlled and by whom. The second was the federal tax structure, specifically, the government's legal authority to collect income directly from citizens. And the third was the structure of political representation, specifically, how one entire chamber of the United States Congress was selected. These are not small things. These are the kinds of changes that reshape how a country operates at its most basic level. Each one, when examined individually, comes with a clear and reasonable-sounding explanation. Historians present them as responses to real problems. Economists describe them as necessary corrections to a system that had been malfunctioning. Political scientists frame them as democratic improvements. And perhaps that is exactly what they were. That is the official position, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because what is rarely done, in classrooms, in textbooks, in popular historical accounts, is examining all 3 changes together, side by side, in the same year, asking not just why each one happened, but why all 3 happened simultaneously. When you do that, the picture begins to look different. It is worth pausing here to consider what it means for 3 major structural changes to arrive within a single calendar year. Legislative years can certainly be productive. Governments pass many laws in a short time, especially during periods of political momentum. That part, on its own, is not unusual. But these were not ordinary pieces of legislation. Each one represented a permanent shift in the relationship between the American government, the American financial system, and the American people. Each one altered something that had been in place, in one form or another, since the founding of the country. The money supply had been managed in a decentralized way for decades. The federal government had operated without a permanent income tax for most of its existence. And senators had been selected by state legislatures, not by direct popular vote, since the Constitution was written. All 3 of those arrangements ended in 1913. That detail sounds minor at first, 3 old systems being replaced by new ones. But it is worth examining more closely, because each replacement moved in the same general direction. Each one centralized something that had previously been more distributed. Each one gave more authority to a smaller group of decision-makers operating at a higher level of the system. Whether that outcome was intended or simply the result of independent reform efforts arriving at the same moment, that is exactly the kind of question that does not have a clean answer. What makes 1913 genuinely unusual is not only what changed, but how those changes have been treated since, across more than a century of historical writing. The 3 major events of that year are almost always discussed in separate contexts. The Federal Reserve Act is covered in economic history. The Income Tax Amendment is covered in tax policy and constitutional law. The change to Senate elections is covered in political science and discussions of democratic reform. Each field has its own literature, its own explanations, its own consensus, but there's almost no tradition of examining them together as 3 parts of a single moment. That absence is curious. It could simply reflect the way academic disciplines divide up historical material, or it could suggest that examining them together leads somewhere that the separate explanations are not equipped to handle. Some researchers have, in fact, examined them together, and the questions they raise are not easy to dismiss. One observation that comes up repeatedly is the question of who was involved in designing these changes. The Federal Reserve, in particular, has a well-documented origin story that does not begin in Congress. It begins in a private meeting. That meeting took place in November 1910, more than 3 years before the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. A small group of men, some of the most powerful bankers in the country, along with a senator and a Treasury official, traveled secretly to an island off the Georgia coast. They used false names. They avoided public attention. They did not want anyone to know they were meeting. At that gathering, they designed what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. This is not a rumor or a theory. It is documented. The participants eventually acknowledged it. One of the attendees wrote about it in detail years later. The meeting on Jekyll Island is now an accepted part of the Federal Reserve's own history, but the question it raises has never been fully resolved. If the Federal Reserve was created to protect the public interest, to stabilize the economy for ordinary Americans, why was its design carried out in secret by private bankers? Why did the people who stood to benefit most from the new system play the central role in designing it? And why did that fact remain hidden for years after the system was already in operation? The official answer is that secrecy was necessary to avoid political opposition. That open discussion would have made the reform impossible to pass. That explanation is understandable in political terms, but it doesn't fully make sense as a justification for a public institution being quietly designed behind closed doors. And that tension between the stated purpose and the actual process is something that keeps appearing the more closely 1913 is examined. The income tax adds a similar layer of uncertainty. When the 16th Amendment was ratified in February 1913, supporters made very clear promises about its scope. The tax, they said, would affect only the wealthiest Americans. The rates were low. The exemptions were high. Average working people were explicitly told they would not be touched by it. For most Americans at the time, the income tax was presented as a measure of fairness, a way to require the richest citizens to contribute more to the running of the country. That framing was politically effective. It passed with support from people who genuinely believed it would not affect them. What followed over the next several decades told a different story. The rates increased. The exemptions narrowed. The definition of taxable income expanded. Step by step, the income tax moved deeper into the financial lives of ordinary Americans, far beyond what was described in 1913. Whether each of those expansions was justified is a separate debate, but the original promise that the tax would remain limited turned out to be temporary at best, and at worst, misleading. This raises questions that go beyond simple policy disagreement. It suggests a gap between what was publicly said in 1913 and what the system actually became. And that gap is difficult to explain entirely through the logic of changing circumstances. Then there's the third change, the one that receives the least attention. The 17th Amendment altered how United States senators were chosen. Before 1913, senators were selected by state legislatures. This was not an accident or an oversight in the original constitutional design. It was intentional. The Senate was meant to represent state governments, while the House represented the general population. The two chambers were designed to be different in character, not just in size. The 17th Amendment replaced that system with direct popular election. On the surface, this is easy to understand as a democratic improvement. And there were genuine problems with the old system: corruption, deadlocked state legislatures, vacant Senate seats. Those problems were real. But the structural consequence is harder to dismiss. By removing the mechanism through which state governments spoke directly in the federal legislature, the amendment fundamentally altered the relationship between states and the federal government. States lost their formal voice. Over the century that followed, federal power expanded significantly and consistently. Whether those two facts are connected is debated, but they are facts. And when placed alongside the Federal Reserve and the income tax, all arriving in the same year, all shifting power in the same general direction, the pattern becomes difficult to explain as coincidence alone. Some researchers say it was coincidence. They argue that progressive political momentum in the early 1900s simply produced multiple reforms at the same time. Others say the reforms were coordinated. not necessarily through a single plan, but through shared interests among a relatively small group of influential people who understood what changes would serve them best. Neither explanation has been proven beyond reasonable doubt, and perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about 1913. The questions it raises are real. The pattern it presents is visible, but the full picture, the complete explanation of why all three changes arrived together, and who truly designed them, remains incomplete. The closer you examine the year, the more that feeling grows, not of certainty, but of something unresolved, something that the standard historical account acknowledges only in fragments, never as a whole. What was really happening in 1913? That question does not have a clean answer, but it deserves to be asked carefully, without exaggeration, and with a willingness to follow the evidence, wherever it leads. Because what changed in that single year is still shaping the way money moves, the way taxes are collected, and the way political power is structured in the United States today. More than a century later, the systems built in 1913 are still running, and the people who designed them, what they intended, what they understood, and what they chose not to say publicly, that remains one of the more quietly unresolved questions in modern American history. The official explanation for what happened in 1913 is not difficult to find. It is presented clearly in textbooks, government records, and historical accounts. And when you first read it, it sounds entirely reasonable. There's a problem. A solution is proposed. Legislation is passed. The end. That is the basic structure of the official story. And on the surface, it holds together well. But holding together on the surface and holding together under examination are two different things. To understand the official explanation, it helps to start where it starts, with the economic conditions of the late 19th and early 20th century. The United States during this period was transforming rapidly. Industrialization was accelerating at a pace that had few historical precedents. Factories were expanding. Railways were spreading across the continent. Cities were growing faster than the infrastructure around them could support. Capital was moving in large quantities, and the financial system that was supposed to manage all of that movement was struggling to keep up. The banking system of that era was fragmented. There was no central authority coordinating how money flowed between institutions. Individual banks operated largely on their own, and when confidence in one began to fall, the effects could spread quickly to others. This was not a theoretical problem. It had been demonstrated repeatedly through a series of financial panics that struck the country throughout the 1800s, in 1837, in 1873, in 1893. Each one caused real damage. Businesses failed. Workers lost employment. Credit dried up. Recovery was slow and uneven. By the early 1900s, the pattern was well established. And then, in 1907, it happened again. This time more severely than most people expected. The Panic of 1907 is the event that the official explanation returns to most often when justifying the creation of the Federal Reserve, and it is not hard to see why. What happened in 1907 was genuinely alarming. It began with a failed attempt to corner the copper market, which triggered a loss of confidence in several banks connected to the scheme. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. Banks, unable to meet the sudden demand, began to fail. The crisis spread from New York outward. Credit markets froze. Companies that had nothing to do with the original failure found themselves unable to borrow money to continue operating. The situation was eventually stabilized, not by the government, but by a private banker named J.P. Morgan, who organized a coordinated response among major financial institutions. Morgan essentially acted as an informal central bank, deciding which institutions would receive support and which would be allowed to fail. His intervention worked, in the sense that the immediate panic subsided, but it also exposed something uncomfortable. The financial stability of the entire United States had depended, in a critical moment, on the personal judgment and resources of a single private individual. That fact made many people uneasy, and it gave reformers a powerful argument. The country needed a formal, institutional solution. It could not rely on private generosity the next time a crisis arrived. That argument became the foundation of the case for the Federal Reserve. Congress, the official explanation says, recognized the danger of a leaderless financial system and acted to correct it. The Federal Reserve Act, signed by President Woodrow Wilson in December 1913, created a network of regional reserve banks operating under a coordinating board in Washington. The new system was designed to act as a lender of last resort, a backstop that could provide liquidity to banks under pressure, preventing local failures from cascading into national crises. On paper, the reasoning is sound. The problem was real. The solution addressed the problem. That is the official story, and it is told with confidence. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the official explanation focuses almost entirely on the problem being solved, and much less on who designed the solution and how. The income tax follows a similar pattern. Before 1913, the federal government raised most of its revenue through tariffs, taxes applied to goods imported from other countries. This system had been in place for most of American history and had, in various forms, funded the government through wars and periods of rapid expansion. But tariffs had limitations. Revenue depended on trade volumes, which fluctuated, and as the government's responsibilities grew, the argument was made that a more stable and scalable source of income was needed. The 16th Amendment, ratified in February 1913, provided that source. It gave Congress the legal authority to impose a tax on income, directly, from individuals and corporations, without having to distribute it among the states according to population, as the Constitution had previously required. Supporters described it as a more equitable system. The wealthy, who earned more, would contribute more. The burden would be proportional to the ability to pay. When the first income tax rates under the new amendment were applied, they were indeed modest. The lowest rate was 1%, applied to incomes above a certain threshold. The highest rate was 7%, applied only to very large incomes. Most Americans fell entirely outside the taxable range. The reform was presented, and apparently understood, as something that would primarily affect the top tier of earners, not ordinary working people. At first, it seems normal, a targeted tax on wealth, designed to fund a growing government. But there is a problem with how that framing held up over time, and that problem becomes relevant when examining what was actually being built in 1913, rather than what was being described publicly. The third change of 1913, the 17th Amendment, came with its own official justification, and this one was framed almost entirely in the language of democracy. The existing system, in which state legislatures chose United States senators, had developed a reputation for corruption and dysfunction. There were documented cases of bribery, in which wealthy interests paid state legislators to select favorable candidates. There were also cases of prolonged deadlock, in which state legislatures failed to agree on a candidate, leaving Senate seats vacant for months or even years. The solution offered by the 17th Amendment was direct popular election. Instead of state legislatures choosing senators, the voters of each state would choose them directly. This was presented as a straightforward democratic improvement, taking power away from potentially corrupt intermediaries and placing it directly in the hands of the people. It is difficult to argue against that framing on purely moral grounds. Corruption was real. Deadlocked legislatures were a genuine problem. Giving citizens a direct vote does sound like an improvement, and for many people in 1913, that was enough. The amendment passed, and the existing system was replaced. What was discussed less openly was the structural consequence of that change. The original design of the Senate, with senators chosen by state governments, was not simply an old tradition. It was a specific mechanism for giving state governments a voice at the federal level. The two chambers of Congress were not meant to be identical in character. The House represented the general population. The Senate was meant to represent the states as political entities. Removing the state legislature's role in choosing senators removed that mechanism entirely. What replaced it was a second popularly elected chamber, different in term length and size, but no longer fundamentally different in its relationship to state authority. Whether that change made American democracy better or worse is a debate that continues. But what can be said without much controversy is that it shifted the balance between state and federal power. States lost a direct instrument of influence, and the federal government, over the century that followed, grew in authority and scope in ways that would have been difficult to imagine in 1912. 3 changes. 3 clear official explanations. Each one addresses a real problem. Each one proposes a logical solution. Each one was passed through the normal legislative process and signed into law. And for many historians, That is where the discussion ends. The problems existed. The solutions were implemented. The intentions, at least as stated publicly, were good. To question further, in this view, is to invite speculation where the record is already clear. But this is where the explanation starts to weaken. Not because the official account is obviously false, but because it is incomplete. It accounts for the stated reasons behind each change. It does not fully account for why all three arrived in the same year, moving in the same structural direction, after years of debate and delay. The Federal Reserve had been discussed for years before 1913. Various proposals for banking reform had been circulating since at least the early 1900s. None had succeeded. Then, within a single legislative session, a version was passed. The income tax had faced constitutional obstacles and political resistance for decades. A previous attempt had been struck down by the Supreme Court in 1895. Then, relatively quickly, the amendment process was completed and the tax was enacted. The 17th Amendment had been proposed in various forms for years. State legislatures, which were being asked to give up their power to choose senators, ratified it in just under 11 months. 3 stalled or previously blocked reforms, all completing in the same year. That detail sounds minor at first, but it becomes harder to explain the more closely it is examined. What changed? What made 1913 the year when 3 separate long-standing obstacles were overcome simultaneously? The official explanation does not fully answer that question. It points to the progressive political climate of the era, to public pressure for reform, to a general appetite for change in the early Wilson administration. Those factors were real, but they had also been present, in various degrees, in the years before 1913. They do not clearly explain why that specific year was different. Some researchers believe the answer lies in organization, that the changes of 1913 were not simply parallel responses to parallel problems, but were connected at a level that the official record does not reflect. Others maintain that the timing was the product of political momentum, coincidence, and the natural clustering of reform efforts. Neither position has been proven definitively. What remains is a gap between the explanation that is offered and the question that it leaves open. The official account of 1913 is coherent. It is documented. It is, in its broad outlines, accurate. But coherent and complete are not the same thing. And the question of why 3 major structural changes arrived together without a clear common cause in the official record is one that the standard explanation does not fully resolve. That unresolved detail is not a small thing. It sits at the center of 1913, and it is where the investigation, if one chooses to continue it, genuinely begins. At first, it seems entirely normal that a productive legislative year would produce multiple significant reforms. Governments have always worked this way. Political momentum builds, the right conditions align, and several long-debated issues find resolution within a short window of time. That explanation is reasonable. It is how most historians frame 1913, and on the surface, it holds together without obvious contradiction. But here is where the first problem appears, and it is not a small one. The Federal Reserve, the institution that would go on to control the American money supply for the next century and beyond, was not designed in Congress. It was not shaped through open public hearings or debated transparently by elected representatives responding to their constituents. Much of its actual structure, the working blueprint that eventually became law, was drafted privately, quietly, away from Washington, away from the press, and away from the public entirely. To understand what this means, it helps to know where that private drafting took place. In November 1910, a group of men boarded a private railcar in New Jersey and traveled south. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a private resort off the coast of Georgia that at the time was accessible only to members of an exclusive club. The island was isolated, remote. It was exactly the kind of place where a meeting could take place without attracting attention. And that, it appears, was precisely the point. The men who made that journey were not ordinary travelers. They included Nelson Aldrich, a powerful Republican senator who chaired the Senate Finance Committee and had spent years studying European central banking models. There was Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, one of the largest financial institutions in the country at the time. There was Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. There was Benjamin Strong, who would later become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And there was Paul Warburg, a German-born banker with deep expertise in European central banking systems, who had immigrated to the United States and become a partner at Kyun, Loeb and Company. Also present was A. Piatt Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. These were not minor figures. Collectively, they represented a concentration of financial power that was difficult to overstate. The institutions connected to the men in that railcar controlled a significant portion of the country's total banking assets. They were, by any reasonable measure, among the most influential people in American finance, and they traveled to Jekyll Island under false names. That detail sounds unusual at first, but it becomes more significant the more closely it is examined. The men did not use their real names during the journey or during the meeting itself. They referred to each other only by first names. Aldrich instructed the group not to be seen together in public, and not to allow their association to become known. One participant later wrote that if word had gotten out that this particular group of bankers had gathered to design a new banking system, the resulting public opposition would have made the entire effort impossible. That explanation is worth sitting with for a moment, because it raises an obvious and important question. If the purpose of the Federal Reserve was genuinely to protect ordinary Americans, to create a stable financial system that would prevent the kind of bank panics that had repeatedly caused suffering for working people, why would public knowledge of its design process create opposition strong enough to destroy it? The standard answer is that banking reform was politically sensitive, and that any plan visibly associated with Wall Street would be attacked as serving financial elites rather than the general public. That is a plausible political calculation. Legislative history is full of examples where the public framing of a policy matters as much as the policy itself. If ordinary voters believed the Federal Reserve was designed by bankers for bankers, they would pressure their representatives to reject it, regardless of whether the system was actually good for them. That logic is understandable, but it doesn't fully make sense as a justification, because the very concern being used to explain the secrecy, that people would believe the system was designed to serve financial elites, was arguably a legitimate concern. The system was being designed by financial elites. The worry was not irrational. It was accurate. This is where the explanation becomes difficult. The secrecy is justified by the need to avoid the perception that private bankers were shaping a public institution. But private bankers were, in fact, shaping a public institution. The secrecy was not protecting a false impression. It was preventing an accurate one from reaching the people who would be affected by the decision. The Jekyll Island meeting lasted approximately 9 days. During that time, the participants drafted a detailed plan for what they called a National Reserve Association, a network of regional reserve banks that would hold member bank reserves, issue currency, and act as a lender of last resort during financial crises. It was, in its essential features, the blueprint that would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. When the group returned from Jekyll Island, the plan was not immediately introduced to Congress under its true origins. Senator Aldrich introduced it publicly as his own reform proposal, the Aldrich Plan, without disclosing that it had been collaboratively drafted with private bankers at a secret meeting on a private island. The plan's origins and the identities of the people who shaped it were not disclosed. The Aldrich Plan itself did not pass Congress. It was criticized by Democrats, in part because of its close association with Aldrich and the banking interests he represented. But this is where the timeline becomes interesting. When the Federal Reserve Act was eventually introduced and passed in 1913, its supporters were careful to distance it from the Aldrich Plan and from Wall Street. The new bill was framed as a different kind of reform, more democratic, more balanced, more protective of the public interest. Some researchers who have compared the two documents side by side have noted that the similarities between the Aldrich Plan and the Federal Reserve Act are substantial. The core mechanisms, the reserve structure, the lender of last resort function, the relationship between member banks and the central authority, are closely aligned. The political framing was different. The underlying architecture, many argue, was not. Whether that represents a genuine reform of the original plan or simply a repackaging of it is a question that historians continue to debate. What is not debated is that the men who drafted the original blueprint at Jekyll Island were deeply familiar with the final legislation, and that at least some of them played a role in shaping its passage. The secrecy surrounding Jekyll Island did not end when the Federal Reserve was created. For years after the system was operational, the meeting remained undisclosed. One of the participants, Frank Vanderlip, eventually wrote about it publicly, but not until 1935, more than 2 decades after the Federal Reserve Act was signed. By that point, the institution was firmly established and operating. Whatever public debate might have occurred before its creation had long since become irrelevant. That timing raises questions of its own. Why was the disclosure made when it was, when the Federal Reserve was already embedded in American financial life, rather than earlier? Was the long silence a matter of personal discretion, or something more deliberate? The record does not provide a clear answer. What the record does show is that knowledge of the meeting's existence, and of who attended it, was kept out of public view during the most critical period, the years when banking reform was being debated and decided. The people who would be affected by the outcome did not have access to information about who was designing it or what their interests were. Some argue that this kind of behind-the-scenes policy design is simply how complex legislation works. Technical subjects require technical expertise. Bringing private sector specialists into the design process is not unusual, and it does not automatically mean the resulting policy serves only those specialists. Experts are consulted on many kinds of legislation, and that consultation is not always made public in real time. That argument is reasonable, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But there is a difference between consulting experts and allowing the primary beneficiaries of a new system to draft its structure in secret, under false names, without any public awareness that the process was occurring. The first is a normal feature of complex policymaking. The second is something harder to categorize. There is also the matter of who was not in the room at Jekyll Island. No representatives of labor, no farmers, who at the time made up a significant portion of the American workforce, no small business owners from outside the financial sector, no economists with dissenting views on central banking. The people who shaped the Federal Reserve's foundational structure were drawn from a very specific segment of American society, the upper tier of the financial industry, and they worked without input or oversight from anyone outside that circle. Whether the resulting system was designed primarily for the public good or primarily for the convenience of large financial institutions is the central question that the Jekyll Island meeting leaves open. The participants, in their later accounts, insisted their intentions were constructive. They believed, or said they believed, that a stable central banking system would benefit everyone, not just the banks. That claim cannot be dismissed outright. Stable financial systems do provide general benefits, but the design choices made at Jekyll Island, which institutions would have influence over the new system, how the governing structure would be organized, which functions the reserve banks would perform, all of those decisions were made by people with direct financial interests in the outcome, and those decisions were made in secret, without accountability to the public that would ultimately be governed by the results. This is the first and perhaps most foundational doubt that surrounds 1913. Not that the Federal Reserve was created, but how its creation was managed. Not that reform was needed, but who was allowed to define what reform meant. The problem was real. The need for a solution was genuine, but the process through which the solution was designed, private, undisclosed, controlled by the very interests it was supposed to regulate, does not fit easily into the official explanation of a public institution created for the public good. And once that gap is noticed, it becomes difficult to stop asking what else might not fully fit the explanation being offered. To understand why 1913 matters as much as it does, it helps to step back further, not just a few years, but several decades, because the changes that arrived in 1913 did not appear from nowhere. They were the product of a long and complicated history. A history that, when examined carefully, adds an important layer of context to everything that followed. For most of the 19th century, the United States operated without a permanent central bank. That fact alone is worth pausing on. Today, the idea of a major economy functioning without a central banking authority seems almost unthinkable. Central banks are treated as a fundamental feature of modern financial systems, but for a significant portion of American history, the country deliberately chose not to have one. This was not an oversight. It was a decision, and it was rooted in a specific experience that left a deep mark on American political thinking. In the early decades of the Republic, a central bank did exist. The first Bank of the United States was established in 1791, largely at the urging of Alexander Hamilton, who believed that a centralized financial institution was necessary for a stable national economy. It operated for 20 years, and then its charter was allowed to expire in 1811, amid significant political opposition. A second Bank of the United States followed, chartered in 1816. It too became the center of intense political conflict. President Andrew Jackson made the destruction of the second bank a defining cause of his presidency. He vetoed the renewal of its charter in 1832, and by 1836 the institution was effectively finished. Jackson's opposition to the bank was not primarily technical. It was deeply political. He believed, and said publicly and repeatedly, that a central bank gave too much power to a small group of private financial interests. He believed it served the wealthy at the expense of ordinary Americans. His veto message described the bank as a tool of privilege, benefiting the few while burdening the many. That argument resonated widely. The bank's charter was not renewed, and the country moved forward without a central banking institution. What followed was a long period of decentralized banking. Individual banks operated under state charters, with varying rules and varying levels of stability. There was no single authority coordinating the money supply, no central reserve that could be drawn upon in times of crisis, and no unified system for managing currency across the country. The arrangement was imperfect in ways that became apparent during periods of financial stress. Bank panics occurred. Credit contracted suddenly and painfully. Economic cycles were sharp and sometimes severe. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the decentralized system, for all its instability, also had a feature that is rarely discussed in the standard account of why central banking became necessary. It had no single point of control. No one institution or group of institutions could determine the direction of the entire national money supply. Power was distributed unevenly, certainly, and imperfectly, but distributed nonetheless. That feature mattered deeply to many Americans of the era, and the debate over whether centralized or decentralized financial power was preferable was not simply a technical disagreement among economists. It was one of the most charged political arguments of the 19th century. The tension became particularly visible in the decades following the Civil War. The country was expanding westward. Agriculture was the dominant occupation for a large share of the population. Farmers in the South and Midwest were deeply dependent on credit to buy land, to purchase equipment, to survive the gap between planting and harvest. And the terms of that credit were set by a banking system that was concentrated primarily in the northeastern states, particularly in New York. This geographic concentration of financial power created friction that was difficult to contain. Farmers who needed loans found themselves subject to interest rates and credit conditions determined by distant institutions, with no particular interest in agricultural communities. When credit tightened, as it periodically did, the effects fell hardest on those who had the least ability to absorb them. Farms were lost. Families were displaced. The economic cycles that financial historians describe in relatively neutral terms were, for many people, experienced as genuine hardship. Out of this frustration grew a series of political movements that, by the 1890s, had coalesced into a significant political force. The populist movement, in particular, made financial reform central to its platform. Its supporters argued that the money supply was being deliberately kept too tight, that deflationary pressure was serving the interests of creditors while destroying the livelihoods of debtors. They called for an expansion of the currency, experimentation with silver-backed money alongside gold, and greater democratic control over financial policy. The currency debates of the late 1800s, whether money should be backed strictly by gold, or whether silver should also be used as a monetary base, sound technical and remote today. But they were anything but abstract at the time. The choice between gold and silver was a choice about who held economic power. A gold standard kept the money supply relatively tight, which favored lenders. A silver standard would expand the money supply, making it easier for debtors to repay what they owed. Every farmer, every small business owner, every worker who had borrowed money had a direct stake in how that question was answered. The political battles over these questions were intense. William Jennings Bryan, a a Democratic presidential candidate who ran 3 times between 1896 and 1908, built his campaign largely around opposition to the gold standard and support for silver coinage. His famous speech at the 1896 Democratic National Convention, in which he declared that mankind should not be crucified on a cross of gold, is still remembered as one of the most passionate statements of economic populism in American political history. He lost all 3 elections. That detail is worth noting. The reform movements of the late 1800s and early 1900s were vocal and energetic. They drew real support from large segments of the population, but they did not succeed in fundamentally reshaping the financial system. The interests they were pushing against were deeply embedded in both major political parties. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. By the early years of the 20th century, large banking institutions, particularly those centered in New York, had accumulated not just financial resources, but political influence of a substantial kind. They funded political campaigns. They had relationships with key members of Congress. They employed people who moved in and out of government positions. The line between the financial sector and the political system was blurry in ways that reformers consistently pointed out and consistently struggled to change. Progressive movements were gaining strength in response. There was growing public pressure to regulate corporate power, to break up monopolies, to create more accountability in both business and government. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, which ended in 1909, had brought some of this energy into mainstream politics. Trust-busting became a familiar term. Regulation of large industries was increasingly accepted as a legitimate function of government. However, the timeline does not fully match the reform narrative that is often applied to 1913, because the changes that arrived that year, the Federal Reserve, the income tax, the direct election of senators, were not primarily designed by the reform movements that had been pushing for change. They were designed, or significantly shaped, by the very institutional interests that those reform movements had been warning the public about for decades. The men who gathered at Jekyll Island in 1910 were not populist reformers. They were the representatives of the financial establishment that Andrew Jackson had railed against, that the populists had campaigned against, that progressive critics had been identifying as the source of economic inequality. And yet, they were the ones who drafted the blueprint for the new financial system. Some believe this is simply the natural result of complex policymaking. Technical reform requires technical expertise. The people who understand a system best are the people who operate within it. Bringing bankers into the design of banking reform is, from this view, practically necessary, even if politically awkward. Others find that argument deeply unsatisfying. They point out that allowing an industry to design its own regulation is not the same as reforming it, that the interests of large financial institutions and the interests of ordinary Americans are not always aligned, and that a system designed by one group to serve itself may not function as advertised for the other. The historical record from the decades before 1913 supports the concern, at least in part. Every time centralized financial power had been established or expanded in American history, public distrust had followed. The first bank and the second bank had both generated fierce opposition. The concentration of banking power in New York had produced the populist movement and decades of currency conflict. The public had, repeatedly and consistently, expressed concern about what happened when private financial institutions gained control over the systems that governed everyone's economic life. And then, in 1913, a solution arrived. The official explanation said it was designed to address those concerns, to create stability, fairness, and accountability. But the solution had been designed by the institutions that had generated the concerns in the first place. In private, without public participation, without transparency about who was involved or what their interests were. That gap between the problem the public had been identifying for decades and the solution that was ultimately delivered is one that the standard historical account does not fully close. The reforms of 1913 are presented as a response to public demand for change, and in some ways they were, but they were a response shaped almost entirely by people who had the most to gain from a particular kind of change. Whether the system that emerged from that process was designed primarily to serve the public or primarily to serve its designers, that question does not have a simple answer. What can be said is that the history leading up to 1913 does not support an uncomplicated reading of the official explanation. The concerns that had been building for decades were real. The people who ultimately answered those concerns were, in important ways, the same people who had caused them. And that detail, quiet, documented, and rarely examined at the center of the 1913 story, is one of the more important things to keep in mind as the picture continues to unfold. One of the most frequently repeated justifications for the Federal Reserve, the one that appears in textbooks, in official histories, and in the statements of the institution itself, is that it was created to stabilize the American economy, to smooth out the destructive cycles of boom and bust that had plagued the country throughout the 19th century, to prevent the kind of sudden financial panics that had caused widespread damage in 1873, in 1893, and most recently in 1907. That was the promise. That was the stated mission. And it was a mission that, at least in its framing, seemed genuinely worthwhile. But this is where the explanation starts to weaken, because the earliest decades of the Federal Reserve's operation do not align comfortably with that stated purpose. To appreciate how significant this inconsistency is, it helps to understand what the Federal Reserve was actually empowered to do. When it was created in 1913, it was given tools that no previous American financial institution had possessed in such a formal and centralized way. It could set the interest rates at which member banks borrowed money. It could expand or contract the money supply by buying or selling government securities. It could act as a lender of last resort, providing funds to banks that were under pressure, preventing individual failures from triggering wider collapse. These were powerful instruments. Used carefully and with good judgment, they could, in theory, provide exactly the kind of stabilization that reformers had been demanding. The question is whether they were used that way, and the early record raises serious doubts. Just 7 years after the Federal Reserve was established, the United States entered a sharp economic contraction. The years 1920 and 1921 brought a recession that, while shorter than what would come later, was significant in its severity. Industrial production fell. Unemployment rose quickly, and critically, the Federal Reserve's response during this period involved raising interest rates substantially, tightening the money supply at precisely the moment when the economy was already contracting. Businesses that had been operating on credit found that credit was suddenly more expensive and harder to obtain. Many did not survive. Farmers were among the hardest hit. Agricultural communities had borrowed heavily during the First World War, when demand for food production was high and prices were favorable. When the contraction arrived and credit tightened, many found themselves unable to service their debts. Land that families had worked for generations was lost. The rural devastation of the early 1920s is not as well remembered as what came later, but for the communities that experienced it, the impact was severe and lasting. That detail sounds minor at first. Recession, a difficult period, the kind of economic turbulence that has always occurred throughout history. But it becomes more significant when examined in the context of what the Federal Reserve was created to prevent. A contraction in which the central bank tightened credit rather than loosening it, during a period when businesses and farmers were already struggling, does not fit easily into the narrative of an institution designed to protect the economy from exactly this kind of harm. And then came 1929. What began as a stock market collapse deepened into the most severe economic crisis in American history. The Great Depression lasted for years. Unemployment reached levels that had not been seen before and have not been seen since. Banks failed by the thousands. The savings of ordinary people disappeared. Industrial output collapsed. Agricultural prices fell so far that farmers destroyed crops they could not sell rather than pay to transport them to market. The Federal Reserve existed throughout this entire period. It had the tools. It had the authority. And the question of what it did or failed to do with those tools during the Depression has been examined by economists and historians for decades. The findings are not comfortable for the institution's defenders. Studies conducted long after the events, including influential work by economists who examined the Federal Reserve's internal records and decision-making processes from that era, suggested that monetary policy during the early years of the Depression may have significantly worsened the crisis. Instead of expanding the money supply to counteract the deflationary spiral, the Federal Reserve allowed and in some interpretations, contributed to a severe contraction in the availability of money and credit. Banks that were struggling did not receive the kind of support that a functioning lender of last resort was supposed to provide. The crisis deepened in ways that better policy choices might have moderated. This is not a fringe interpretation. It has been acknowledged at the highest levels of the institution itself. In 2002, at a conference honoring the work of economist Milton Friedman, a senior Federal Reserve official stated publicly that Friedman's analysis of the Fed's role in the Depression was correct and offered something close to an institutional acknowledgement of responsibility for the failures of that period. But this is where it becomes unclear, because if the Federal Reserve's own representatives acknowledged, decades later, that the institution had failed in its core mission during one of the most critical periods in American history, that raises a question that the official origin story does not answer. Was the failure the result of poor judgment, limited understanding, and the genuine difficulty of managing an unprecedented crisis? Or did it reflect something about the structure of the institution itself, about whose interests it was actually designed to serve? That question leads to the second major inconsistency that surrounds the Federal Reserve, and this one is structural, not historical. It concerns who actually controls the system and what that control means. The Federal Reserve is consistently described in public discourse as a government institution. It is called a federal agency. Its chair is appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Its decisions affect the entire American economy and, by extension, much of the global financial system. In these respects, it functions like a government body, making decisions that carry the force of public policy. But this description is incomplete in ways that matter significantly. The Federal Reserve System is not structured like a typical government agency. At its center is the Board of Governors in Washington, which does operate under federal appointment. But the system also includes 12 regional Federal Reserve banks in cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and others. And these regional banks are not government-owned. They are owned by their member banks. Private commercial banks hold stock in the regional Federal Reserve banks. They receive dividends from that stock. And the presidents of those regional banks, who participate in the critical committee that sets interest rate policy, are selected through a process that involves those same private member banks. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York deserves particular attention in this context. It is the most powerful of the 12 regional banks, responsible for carrying out the open market operations through which monetary policy is implemented. Its president participates in interest rate decisions, and its governance structure, like that of the other regional banks, involves significant influence from private financial institutions. Some say this structure is a reasonable and practical compromise. Central banking requires deep expertise in financial markets. Connecting the institution to the private banking sector ensures that it has access to real-world knowledge and experience. The involvement of private banks in the governance structure is, from this view, a feature rather than a flaw, a way of keeping the institution grounded in the realities of how money actually moves. Others believe it represents a fundamental conflict of interest. The banks that are regulated by the Federal Reserve are also, in a meaningful sense, its owners. They hold stock in the regional banks. They have representation in the governance structure. They benefit directly from certain kinds of monetary policy and are harmed by others. Asking an institution to regulate and to serve the interests it is governed by simultaneously is, from this view, a structural problem that no amount of good intention can fully resolve. The line between public institution and private control has never been made entirely clear. The Federal Reserve's own communications tend to emphasize its public character, its congressional mandate, its presidential appointments, its stated commitment to the public interest. But the ownership structure of the regional banks and the role of private banking interests in its governance tells a more complicated story. This ambiguity was not accidental. It was, in fact, the product of deliberate design decisions made at Jekyll Island and refined during the legislative process of 1913. The architects of the system, themselves private bankers, faced a political environment in which a purely private central bank would have been unacceptable to the public. The memory of the Second Bank of the United States and the intense opposition it had generated was still part of the political conversation. A central bank that was visibly controlled by private interests would not survive the legislative process. The solution was a hybrid structure, one that could be described as a government institution for purposes of public legitimacy, while preserving meaningful influence for private banking interests in its actual operation. Whether that hybrid was a genuine compromise or a carefully constructed arrangement that gave the appearance of public control while maintaining private influence. That is the question that the structural inconsistency raises, and that the official explanation does not fully resolve. However, the timeline does not fully match the simple reform narrative. If the Federal Reserve was designed as a public institution for the public good, it is worth asking why its earliest major tests, 1920 to 1921, and then 1929 to 1933, produced outcomes so at odds with its stated mission. It is worth asking why its governance structure gives private banks a role that would be considered inappropriate in almost any other regulatory context. And it is worth asking why these features of the system, the hybrid ownership, the private bank representation, the structural ambiguity, were built into the institution from the beginning by the very people who stood to benefit from them. None of these questions have clean answers. The historical record is complex, and reasonable people examining the same evidence have reached different conclusions. But the inconsistencies are real. They are documented, and they persist across more than a century of the institution's operation. The Federal Reserve was created with a clear and publicly stated mission. The early decades of its existence raised serious doubts about whether that mission was being fulfilled, or whether the institution was structured in a way that made fulfilling it genuinely difficult. Those doubts have not been fully resolved by the explanations that followed, and they remain quietly embedded in the historical record for anyone willing to examine them carefully. The Income Tax Amendment adds another layer to the uncertainty surrounding 1913, and in some ways, it is the layer that raises the most precise and uncomfortable questions, because unlike the Federal Reserve, whose structural ambiguities require some knowledge of banking to fully appreciate, the income tax is something that virtually every working American has a direct and personal relationship with. It touches daily life in a way that abstract monetary policy does not, and its origins in 1913 are considerably more complicated than the simple reform narrative suggests. To understand what changed, it helps to understand what existed before the change. For most of American history, the federal government did not collect taxes directly from individual citizens based on what they earned. The primary source of federal revenue was tariffs, taxes applied to goods imported from other countries. When a ship arrived carrying foreign manufactured products, the government collected a portion of the value at the point of entry. That money funded federal operations. It paid for the military, for government administration, for infrastructure, and for the various functions that the national government was expected to perform. This system had genuine limitations. Revenue fluctuated with trade volumes, which rose and fell with economic conditions and international relationships. When trade declined, government revenue declined with it. The tariff system also had political complications. Different industries lobbied for different rates, and tariff policy became a source of constant legislative conflict. It was not a perfect system. Few people in 1913 were arguing that it was, but it had one feature that is rarely discussed in the standard account of why the income tax was necessary. A government that funds itself through tariffs is dependent on the activity of trade. Its revenue is, in a meaningful sense, tied to the economy's performance in a visible and somewhat natural way. It cannot simply decide to collect more money from its citizens by changing a rate. It must wait for trade to generate the revenue. The 16th Amendment changed that relationship permanently, and the change was more significant than it is usually described. When the amendment was ratified in February 1913, it gave Congress the authority to collect taxes on income from whatever source derived, without having to distribute the revenue among states according to population, as the Constitution had previously required. That technical-sounding legal change had enormous practical consequences. It meant that the federal government now had a direct and theoretically expandable claim on the earnings of every person and institution in the country. The ceiling, if there was one, was political rather than structural. At first, it seems normal, a targeted, limited adjustment to an outdated revenue system. The rates introduced alongside the amendment were modest. 1% on incomes above $3,000 per year, a progressive surtax reaching 7% only on very high incomes, those above $500,000 annually, which in 1913 represented extraordinary wealth. The exemption thresholds were set high enough that the vast majority of Americans fell entirely outside the taxable range. Supporters made this point explicitly and repeatedly. The income tax, they argued, was a measure of fairness directed at the wealthy, at the industrialists, the financiers, the owners of large enterprises who had accumulated vast fortunes during decades of rapid economic growth. Ordinary workers, farmers, and small business owners were told, clearly and publicly, that the new tax was not for them. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the rates and exemptions of 1913 were not permanent features of the system. They were the starting point of a system that was, by its legal design, fully expandable, and the expansion that followed was neither slow nor modest. The first significant change came almost immediately. The United States entered the First World War in 1917. Wartime financing required enormous revenue. The income tax rates were raised substantially. The top rate climbed to over 60% by 1918. The exemption thresholds were lowered, bringing millions of Americans into the taxable range who had been told the tax would never affect them. The war emergency provided the political justification for changes that would have been very difficult to pass in peacetime. After the war ended, rates came down somewhat, but they never returned to 1913 levels, and the precedent had been set. The income tax had demonstrated that it could be expanded rapidly when political conditions required it. The infrastructure was in place. The legal authority was established. The process of expanding reach and raising rates had been normalized. The Second World War produced another dramatic expansion. By the mid-1940s, the income tax had reached deep into the middle class. Payroll withholding was introduced, meaning taxes were collected automatically from wages before workers received them, a change that made the tax largely invisible in day-to-day life while making compliance automatic. The exemption thresholds were lowered further. The definition of taxable income broadened. What had been described in 1913 as a tax on extraordinary wealth had, within 3 decades, become a standard feature of working life for the majority of Americans. That trajectory is worth examining carefully. Not because taxation itself is inherently problematic. Governments require revenue, and income taxes are a common feature of modern economies worldwide, but because the trajectory raises a specific question about what was actually understood and intended in 1913, and what was said publicly at the time. Were the politicians and reformers of 1913 genuinely unaware that the system they were creating could expand the way it did? Did they truly believe the modest initial rates and high exemptions would remain permanent features? Or was the limited framing of the income tax in 1913 a necessary political strategy, a way of passing a system that would later be used in ways the public had not been prepared to expect? The historical record does not answer that question cleanly. Some of the amendment's supporters appear to have been genuinely committed to a narrow application. Others, reviewing the debates of the period, appear to have understood quite clearly that they were creating a flexible instrument, one whose scope could be adjusted by Congress as circumstances required. Those two groups were both present in 1913, and they do not always appear to have been fully transparent with each other, or with the public, about what the system might eventually become. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because 1913 did not produce just one transformative change to the financial relationship between the government and its citizens. It produced two. And when those two changes are examined together, rather than separately, as they usually are, a pattern emerges that is hard to dismiss as coincidence. The Federal Reserve, created in December 1913, established a system through which the federal government could borrow money. The central bank could purchase government securities, essentially lending money to the government by buying its debt. This gave the government access to financing that was not directly dependent on tax revenue in any given year. The government could spend beyond its immediate income and repay later. The income tax, established earlier in 1913, created the mechanism through which that repayment would occur. A reliable, expandable, direct claim on the earnings of American citizens and corporations, one that could be adjusted upward as the government's financing needs grew. Put those two systems together, and what you have is a complete cycle. The government borrows from the banking system. The banking system holds government debt and earns interest on it. The government repays that debt and funds that interest through taxes collected from the population. The population provides the revenue that flows through the government to the banking system and back. Some researchers have noted this connection directly and argued that it reflects deliberate design, that the two systems were conceived together by overlapping groups of people with shared interests, precisely because each one made the other more functional and more permanent. A central bank that could lend to the government was more powerful if the government had a reliable income stream to service its debts. An income tax was more politically sustainable if it was tied to the functioning of the national financial system rather than to direct government spending choices alone. Others dismiss this reading as an oversimplification. Governments borrow and tax simultaneously in virtually every modern economy. The relationship between debt financing and tax revenue is a basic feature of public finance, not evidence of a hidden arrangement. The fact that two systems work together does not mean they were designed together with that working relationship in mind. That counterargument is reasonable, and it deserves serious consideration. The presence of a logical relationship between two policies does not automatically mean the relationship was intentional. Complex systems often develop functional connections that were not centrally planned, but the timing remains a detail that does not disappear simply because a counterargument exists. Both systems were created in the same year by a Congress operating under a new presidential administration, following years during which each had faced significant obstacles. Both were shaped, at some stage of their development, by people connected to the private financial sector, and both, in their long-term operation, expanded well beyond what was publicly described at the moment of their creation. That pattern, two systems, same year, same direction of expansion, origins involving the same overlapping networks of financial and political influence, is the kind of pattern that tends to generate questions precisely because the standard explanation does not fully account for it. However, the timeline does not fully match the simple narrative of independent parallel reforms. If the income tax was simply a revenue measure and the Federal Reserve was simply a banking stability measure, the fact that they were created simultaneously and function as complementary parts of a single financial cycle requires more explanation than the official account typically provides. The question of whether that complementary relationship was the product of foresight, of shared interests, of coordinated design, or of historical coincidence, that question sits at the center of what makes 1913 genuinely difficult to fully explain. What changed in 1913 was not just a tax rate or a banking structure. What changed was the fundamental financial relationship between the American government, the American banking system, and the American people. That relationship, debt, interest, taxation, repayment, has operated continuously since 1913, growing larger and more complex with each passing decade. Whether it was built that way by design, or whether it simply grew that way through accumulated decisions over time, remains one of the more quietly unresolved questions in the history of that year. The two systems exist. The connection between them is real. The explanation for why they arrived together in the same year remains incomplete. And that gap between what is documented and what is fully explained is where the deeper uncertainty about 1913 continues to live. When you step back from the individual events of 1913 and stop examining each one in isolation, something becomes visible that is easy to miss when the changes are studied separately. A pattern. Not a pattern that requires speculation to identify. It is present in the documented record, in the stated purposes of each reform, and in what those reforms actually produced over time. And once it is noticed, it is difficult to look at 1913 the same way again. Each of the three major changes from that year was presented to the public in the language of reform. That word, reform, carried significant weight in the early 20th century. The progressive era had made reform a broadly popular concept. People were genuinely frustrated with the concentration of economic and political power that had developed during the industrial age. Monopolies controlled entire industries. Banking interests held enormous influence over government. Ordinary citizens felt that the system was tilted against them. The appetite for genuine change was real, and the political language of 1913 spoke directly to that appetite. The Federal Reserve was framed as protection against the financial panics that had repeatedly devastated ordinary Americans. The income tax was framed as a tool for making the wealthy contribute fairly to the cost of running the country. The direct election of senators was framed as a democratic correction, returning genuine political power to the citizens who had been shut out by a system vulnerable to corruption and elite manipulation. 3 reforms. 3 clear promises, each one aimed, at least in its public presentation, at redistributing power downward, away from concentrated interests and toward ordinary people. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the long-term outcomes of all 3 reforms moved in a direction that is difficult to reconcile with those stated purposes. Not in small ways, in significant and measurable ways that have persisted across more than a century. The Federal Reserve did not distribute financial authority more broadly. It concentrated it. Before 1913, the absence of a central bank meant that no single institution had the power to expand or contract the national money supply at will. Power was fragmented, imperfectly, and with real costs, but fragmented nonetheless. After 1913, a small group of appointed officials, operating within an institution whose governance included significant private banking influence, held authority over the most fundamental levers of the national economy: interest rates, money supply, credit availability, the conditions under which businesses could borrow, grow, or survive. All of these came under the influence of a body that most Americans could not name, could not vote for, and had almost no direct mechanism for influencing. That outcome, the replacement of a fragmented, imperfect system with a centralized one controlled by unelected officials with private sector ties, is not what the reform narrative promised. The promise was stability for everyone. The structure that was delivered concentrated decision-making power in a way that had never previously existed in American financial history. The income tax followed a similar arc. In 1913, the promise was explicit. The tax would affect only the wealthy. The rates were low. The exemptions were high. The average working American was told, directly and repeatedly, that this was not a concern for them. That framing was what made the amendment politically viable. Without it, passage would have been far more difficult. At first, it seems normal that rates and thresholds might shift over time in response to changing circumstances. Tax policy is not static in any country. Adjustments are made as needs evolve. That part in isolation is unremarkable. But there's a problem with applying that logic to the income tax without acknowledging the scale and direction of what actually happened. Within a few decades, the income tax had moved so far from its original framing that the gap between the promise of 1913 and the reality of subsequent decades became very difficult to explain as simple adjustment. The rates did not modestly increase. They climbed dramatically during wartime and never fully retreated. The exemptions did not gradually narrow. They were lowered significantly, pulling millions of ordinary workers into a system they had been told was not for them. The withholding system, introduced during the Second World War, made the process largely automatic. Taxes collected before wages were even received, normalizing a level of government access to individual income that would have been politically unthinkable to propose openly in 1913. Whether each of those expansions was justified by the circumstances that produced it is a separate question. The point is the direction. Every significant change to the income tax after 1913 moved in the same direction, expanding government reach into individual earnings, broadening the base, increasing the rates for more people. The system created in 1913 as a narrow instrument became, over time, a comprehensive one. And that transformation happened through a structure that the 16th Amendment made permanently available, an expandable, adjustable, constitutionally grounded claim on individual income that required only congressional action to enlarge. The 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, presents the most subtle version of this pattern, but in some ways the most structurally significant one. The reform argument for direct election was genuine. The existing system had real problems. Corruption in state legislatures was documented. Deadlocked appointments left seats vacant. The process had become, in visible ways, susceptible to wealthy interests that could influence or simply purchase state legislative votes. The case for reform was not fabricated. It reflected real dysfunction. But the solution chosen, replacing state legislative appointment with direct popular election, addressed the visible problem while creating a less visible structural change that went largely undiscussed at the time. The original design of the Senate was not arbitrary. It placed state governments as political institutions inside the federal legislative process. Senators were answerable to state legislatures, which were in turn subject to the voters of their states. The system gave state governments a formal mechanism for influencing federal policy and for resisting federal encroachment on state authority. That mechanism disappeared in 1913. After the 17th Amendment, both chambers of Congress derived their authority from direct popular election. The Senate was no longer structurally distinct from the House in terms of its relationship to state power. And over the century that followed, the balance between state and federal authority shifted significantly, with the federal government expanding in scope and authority in ways that would have required much more negotiation under the original constitutional arrangement. Some constitutional scholars argue that this shift was the inevitable product of modernization, that a growing, complex industrial society required stronger central coordination regardless of what the Senate's election method was. Others argue that the removal of state legislative appointment was a contributing factor to federal expansion, that it eliminated a specific structural check that had been deliberately placed in the Constitution for exactly that purpose. The disagreement is real and unresolved, but the pattern it contributes to is difficult to ignore. 3 reforms. Each one removed or weakened a structural check on centralized authority. The Federal Reserve removed the check of a decentralized, uncoordinated banking system. The income tax removed the practical check on federal revenue that the tariff system had imposed. And the direct election of senators removed the formal check that state governments had held over the federal legislature. Researcher after researcher who has examined this period in detail, across economics, constitutional law, and political history, notes the same tension. The stated purpose of each reform was to limit or correct concentrated power. The practical outcome of each reform was to enable or expand a different form of concentrated power, operating at a higher level of the system. That tension does not resolve itself simply by being acknowledged. It remains present in the historical record, persistent and difficult to explain away. This raises questions that go beyond simple policy disagreement. Policy disagreements are normal. Reforms produce unintended consequences. Systems evolve in ways their designers did not anticipate. All of that is true, and all of it offers a partial explanation for the gap between the promises of 1913 and the outcomes that followed. But partial explanations are not complete ones. And when the same gap between stated purpose and practical outcome appears not in one reform but in 3, all arriving simultaneously, all moving in the same structural direction, the explanation of unintended consequences becomes harder to accept without qualification. Unintended consequences tend to be varied in their direction. Sometimes a reform produces more of what it promised, sometimes less, sometimes something entirely different. What is unusual about the 3 reforms of 1913 is that their unintended consequences, if that is what they were, all pointed the same way. The year 1913 is often remembered as a turning point in American economic history. The Federal Reserve was established. The income tax became law. These 2 changes alone are enough to fill entire volumes of historical debate. But what is less commonly discussed is that 1913 did not stop there. The changes that arrived in that single year extended beyond money and taxation. They reached into the structure of political representation itself. And when all 3 changes are placed side by side, a pattern begins to emerge that is difficult to explain away with coincidence alone. To understand why this matters, it helps to look at how the American government was originally designed. The founders of the United States did not create a simple democracy where all power flowed directly from popular vote. They built something more layered, more deliberate. The House of Representatives was elected directly by the people. That was intentional, but the Senate was designed differently. Senators were chosen by state legislatures, not by general public election. This distinction was not an oversight or a compromise left over from early political confusion. It was a fundamental feature of the original system. The logic behind it was straightforward. States were meant to have a direct voice inside the federal government. When a senator sat in Washington and voted on national legislation, that senator was expected to represent the interests of the state government that had placed them there. This created a kind of check that went both directions. The federal government could not easily pass laws that harmed states without those states having a formal way to resist. And states, through their appointed senators, remain connected to the national conversation in a structured and meaningful way. This is where the 17th Amendment enters the picture. Ratified in 1913, it changed the method of senatorial election entirely. From that point forward, senators would be chosen by direct popular vote, the same basic method used for the House. On the surface, this sounds like a straightforward improvement. More people participating in more elections seems like a natural expansion of democratic principles. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the original design was not trying to limit democracy. It was trying to balance power between two different levels of government. When that change was made, states lost something specific. They lost their formal, structural mechanism for influencing federal legislation. A senator elected by the general public answers to voters. A senator appointed by a state legislature answers, at least in part, to that legislature. These are not the same relationship. The incentives are different. The pressures are different. And over time, the results are likely to be different as well. Whether that difference is good or bad is genuinely debated. But the structural shift itself is not debatable. It happened. And it happened in 1913. Some constitutional scholars have argued that this single amendment was one of the most consequential structural changes in American political history. Not because of what it said, but because of what it quietly undid. The balance between state authority and federal authority was not just a philosophical preference. It was built into the mechanics of how legislation was created and passed. When senators were chosen by states, states had leverage. After 1913, that leverage was gone. The federal government could expand its reach without facing the same kind of institutional resistance it once would have encountered. Now, whether that expansion of federal power over the following century was caused by the 17th Amendment is a harder argument to make cleanly. History rarely moves in straight lines from a single cause to a single effect. Other forces were at work: industrialization, war, economic crisis, social change. All of these played roles in shaping how the federal government grew throughout the 20th century. Some historians argue the shift in senatorial elections simply reflected a change that was already happening culturally and politically. The formal structure was catching up with reality, not creating a new one. Others disagree. They argue that structures matter precisely because they shape what is possible and what is not. A system where states have institutional power over federal representation produces different outcomes than a system where they do not. Even if the cultural and political winds were already blowing toward greater centralization, removing the structural brake made it easier for that centralization to accelerate without significant opposition. The debate has continued for over a century and has not been resolved. But this is where the examination becomes more interesting and more difficult to set aside. The 17th Amendment did not arrive alone. It arrived alongside the establishment of the Federal Reserve and the ratification of the 16th Amendment, which made the federal income tax permanent and constitutionally grounded. 3 changes, 1 year, and each of them, when examined closely, moved in the same direction. Each of them transferred something, authority, revenue, or political representation, toward the center and away from the periphery. That alignment is what raises questions, not because any single change is impossible to explain on its own terms. Each one has its defenders and its historical justifications, but when they appear together, in the same year, moving in the same direction, the explanation of independent coincidence begins to feel slightly insufficient. At first, it seems normal, separate reforms arriving in a period of progressive political energy. But there's a problem with that explanation. It does not fully account for the precision of the timing or the coherence of the direction. Some researchers have pointed to the concentration of political and financial influence in that era. The early 20th century in the United States was a period when certain figures held enormous economic power. Banking families, industrial magnates, and their networks of political allies shaped policy in ways that were not always visible to the general public. The movement toward these 3 changes did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a political environment where lobbying, private meetings, and concentrated wealth had significant influence over what legislation was considered, debated, and passed. Exactly how much influence, and exactly who held it, is a question that historians continue to work through. What remains difficult to dismiss is that the changes were not random in their effects. If someone had wanted to redesign the American system to make federal authority more durable, more financially independent, and more resistant to state-level opposition, these three changes would have been a reasonable starting point. A central bank that controls monetary policy, a federal income tax that provides a stable and growing revenue base, a Senate that is no longer accountable to state governments. Each piece supports the others. Together, they form something that looks less like a series of separate reforms and more like a coherent shift in how power was organized. That does not mean there was a single architect behind all three. It does not mean a small group sat in a room and designed the transformation of American governance in a single conversation. History rarely works that cleanly, but it does raise the question of whether the cumulative effect was understood by at least some of the people who worked to bring these changes about, whether they saw the full picture while others focused only on the individual reforms in front of them. Old records from that period, archived correspondences, private letters, and financial documents offer fragments of a story, but they do not offer a complete explanation. Some pieces remain missing. There's also the question of what was lost that has never fully been recovered. Before 1913, the relationship between the states and the federal government had a particular character. It was contested, imperfect, and sometimes dysfunctional, but it included a structural tension that kept power from concentrating too quickly at the center. After 1913, that tension did not disappear entirely, but it weakened. The tools available to states for resisting or shaping federal legislation became less formal, more indirect, and ultimately less reliable. And the federal government, now equipped with a permanent revenue stream and a central monetary authority, had resources and capabilities it had never held before. Whether this outcome was positive or negative is not a question with a clean answer. Advocates for stronger federal government point to what was achieved over the following decades: social safety nets, civil rights protections, national infrastructure, responses to economic crises that individual states could not have managed alone. Skeptics point to the growth of federal bureaucracy, the erosion of local autonomy, and the difficulty citizens now face in holding distant institutions accountable. Both sets of concerns are real. Both draw on genuine historical evidence, and both trace at least part of their story back to what changed in 1913. What is perhaps most unusual is how little public attention these connections receive. Even now, the Federal Reserve is widely known but rarely examined in depth by general audiences. The 16th Amendment is taught in schools, but seldom placed in its full historical context. The 17th Amendment is almost forgotten in popular historical memory, despite the significance attributed to it by constitutional scholars. Three changes that may have permanently altered the structure of American governance remain, for most people, disconnected facts from a distant year. Whether that absence of attention is simply the result of complicated history being reduced to simple summaries, or something else, is a question worth sitting with. What 1913 appears to have done, across money, taxation, and political representation, is shift the center of gravity in American governance, quietly, across multiple fronts, in ways whose full consequences took decades to become visible. Whether the people who pushed for these changes understood what they were collectively building, or whether the alignment was genuinely coincidental, remains an open question. The historical record offers clues. It does not offer certainty. And in that gap between what is documented and what is fully understood, the questions continue to sit, unanswered, waiting for a closer examination that has never chew. When examining any significant moment in history, one of the first things that becomes clear is that informed people do not always agree on what that moment meant. This is not unusual. History is rarely a clean set of facts with a single interpretation attached to them. Events are shaped by forces that are sometimes visible and sometimes not. The motivations of the people involved are not always recorded honestly, and the consequences of major decisions can take decades to fully reveal themselves. The events of 1913 are no different. In fact, they may be one of the clearest examples of how the same set of historical facts can lead serious researchers to completely different conclusions. The mainstream view of 1913, the one most commonly found in textbooks and academic histories, treats the changes of that year as genuine, if imperfect, responses to real problems. The United States in the early 20th century was a country undergoing rapid and often destabilizing transformation. Industrialization had created enormous concentrations of private wealth. Economic panics struck repeatedly, causing widespread financial damage that the existing banking system was poorly equipped to contain. Inequality between different regions and different classes was growing in ways that created genuine social pressure. From this perspective, the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the creation of the income tax, and the direct election of senators were all responses to an environment that clearly needed structural reform. Not perfectly designed responses, not reforms without flaws, but genuine attempts to address problems that were visibly affecting ordinary people. This view has significant historical support. The Progressive Era, the political and social movement that surrounded these changes, was a broad and genuinely popular response to the conditions of the time. Journalists were exposing the abuses of industrial monopolies. Reform politicians were winning elections across the country. Public pressure for change was real and widespread. To attribute all of this purely to elite manipulation or hidden coordination requires dismissing a significant amount of documented popular engagement. Mainstream historians are not wrong to point this out. The reform energy of that period was not invented. But this is where the alternative perspective enters, and it does not begin from nothing. A separate tradition of researchers, including some economists, some historians, and some working outside the boundaries of established academic institutions, looks at the same period and sees something different. Not a replacement for the popular reform movement, but something running alongside it. Something that may have shaped it, directed it, or in some cases exploited it. These researchers do not all agree with each other. They do not form a single unified school of thought, but they share a common skepticism about whether the official narrative fully accounts for who actually benefited from what was built in 1913. The Jekyll Island meeting is central to this alternative view. In late 1910, a small group of men gathered in secret at a private hunting club on an island off the coast of Georgia. The participants included Senator Nelson Aldrich, who chaired the Senate Finance Committee, and several representatives of the largest banking interests in the United States. Their stated purpose was to draft a proposal for banking reform. What emerged from those meetings eventually became the foundation of the Federal Reserve Act. The secrecy surrounding the gathering was deliberate. Participants traveled under false names. The location was chosen specifically because it was remote and private. At first, that level of secrecy seems unusual for a group discussing public financial policy, until it is examined more closely. Those who point to Jekyll Island argue that the secrecy was not incidental. It was the point. The men involved knew that a banking reform bill written openly by banking representatives would face enormous public resistance. The reform movement of the time was in many ways driven by suspicion of exactly those kinds of financial interests. A proposal that appeared to be written by the banks, for the banks, would likely be rejected. So the argument goes that the plan was drafted in private, and then introduced through political channels in a way that made it appear to be the result of independent legislative work. Whether that interpretation is accurate, or whether the secrecy reflected more ordinary concerns about premature publicity, remains a contested question. But the meeting itself is documented. That part is not in dispute. The income tax enters this alternative view in a related way. Some researchers argue that the Federal Reserve and the income tax were not separate reforms that happened to arrive in the same year. They argue they were designed together, or at least that their proponents understood how they would work together. A central bank that can expand or contract the money supply creates conditions where government borrowing becomes both easier and more tempting. A permanent income tax provides the revenue base that makes government debt serviceable. One creates the mechanism, the other provides the guarantee. Together, they allow for a level of government spending and borrowing that was not previously possible. Whether this relationship was intentionally engineered or simply emerged from the logic of the situation depends heavily on which documents and which accounts are taken as most reliable. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the historical record is genuinely incomplete in ways that matter. Private correspondence from the most influential financial figures of that period does not always survive. What survives is sometimes curated. Meetings that shaped major policy decisions were not always recorded, and when they were, those records were not always made public. This does not prove deliberate concealment. It may simply reflect how private business was conducted in the early 20th century, but it does mean that the full picture of who decided what and why is not available for direct examination. The 17th Amendment appears differently depending on which interpretation is used as a starting point. In the mainstream view, direct election of senators was a straightforward democratic reform. State legislatures had often been corrupt in selecting senators. Wealthy interests had used their influence over state politics to secure favorable Senate representation. Moving to direct popular election was a way to weaken that kind of manipulation. This is a reasonable argument. Evidence of corruption in senatorial appointments existed and was publicly documented. From this perspective, the amendment was a genuine democratic improvement. The alternative view does not entirely deny these problems, but it reframes the amendment's purpose. If wealthy financial interests already had significant influence over national politics through media, lobbying, and direct relationships with politicians, then the move to direct popular elections did not necessarily weaken their influence. It may have simply changed the channel through which that influence flowed. Reaching state legislatures required engaging with distributed networks of local political power. Reaching general voters could be done through newspapers, public campaigns, and the tools of mass communication. Tools that concentrated financial interests were well positioned to use. The amendment may have appeared to reduce elite influence over the Senate, while actually making that influence more scalable. Some researchers go further than these specific arguments, connecting the changes of 1913 to much broader patterns of financial power across the entire 20th century. They see 1913 not as a starting point, but as a consolidation, a moment when forces that had been building for decades finally secured the institutional arrangements they needed to operate at full scale. From this perspective, the Federal Reserve, the income tax, and the direct election of senators were not three separate reforms. They were three pieces of a structure that, once assembled, would prove very difficult to dismantle. The federal government would have reliable revenue, it would have monetary flexibility, and it would face less effective opposition from the state level. Those who held significant influence over federal policy in 1913 had, through these changes, made that influence more durable. It is important to pause here and note something clearly. Not all of these alternative views carry the same weight. Some are built on carefully documented research, primary sources, and rigorous historical argument. Others rely much more heavily on inference, speculation, and connections that are assumed rather than demonstrated. The distance between a well-researched alternative history and an unfounded conspiracy theory is real, and it matters. Treating all critical perspectives as equally valid would be as misleading as dismissing all of them without examination. Some deserve serious engagement. Others deserve significant skepticism. The difficulty is that sorting between them requires precisely the kind of detailed historical work that most people do not have easy access to. What does seem worth noting is that the alternative perspectives have not simply faded away as more time has passed. Decades after the events of 1913, researchers with serious credentials in economics and history continue to examine the same questions and continue to find the official explanations incomplete. This does not prove the alternative interpretations are correct, but it does suggest that the mainstream account has not fully resolved the questions it was meant to answer. If the reforms of 1913 were straightforwardly beneficial and transparently motivated, it is somewhat unclear why the debates around them remain active more than a century later. At the center of the disagreement is something that is easy to overlook. The core dispute is not really about facts. Most of the facts involved are not in serious contention. The Federal Reserve was established. The income tax was made permanent. The 17th Amendment was ratified. The Jekyll Island meeting occurred. These things are documented and generally accepted. The disagreement is about interpretation, about what those facts mean, about what intentions lay behind them, about whose interests they ultimately served, and whether that service was the goal from the beginning or a consequence that emerged over time. Interpretation is harder to settle than fact. It requires weighing evidence that is often incomplete. It requires making judgments about motivation that cannot always be directly verified. And it is shaped by the frameworks and assumptions that researchers bring to the material. Someone who begins with deep trust in established institutions will read the same documents differently from someone who begins with skepticism about concentrated financial power. Neither starting point is inherently wrong. Both can lead to blind spots. And the historical record, with its gaps, its curated archives, its missing conversations, does not always provide enough clear evidence to settle the question in either direction. What remains is a set of events that sit at the intersection of genuine reform and possible manipulation, without the full documentation needed to firmly establish which element dominated. The records that exist point in multiple directions. The motivations of the key figures can be argued from several angles. The consequences unfolded over decades in ways that serve different narratives, depending on which outcomes are emphasized. And in that space of genuine uncertainty, the alternative views continue to find an audience, not because people are simply drawn to suspicious explanations, but because the questions those views raise have never been fully and satisfactorily answered. That fact alone is worth sitting with, even if no clean conclusion follows from. After examining the events of 1913 from multiple angles, the financial structures, the taxation system, the shift in political representation, the competing interpretations, a reasonable person might expect to arrive at some kind of settled conclusion. A clear answer about what happened, why it happened, and what it ultimately meant. But that is not quite where this examination leads. Instead, it leads to a place that is more uncomfortable and, in some ways, more honest. A place where the questions remain open, where the evidence points in more than one direction, and where certainty is harder to justify than continued inquiry. That discomfort is worth paying attention to. When a significant historical moment resists clean resolution, not because the facts are hidden, but because their meaning remains genuinely contested, it usually signals that something important is still being worked out. And 1913, more than a century later, still appears to be in that category. The events of that year did not close a debate. They opened one that has continued, quietly and persistently, ever since. To understand why that matters, it helps to revisit what actually changed. In the span of a single year, 3 distinct but interconnected transformations were made to the foundations of American public life. The Federal Reserve was established, creating for the first time a centralized institution with authority over the nation's money supply and banking system. The 16th Amendment was ratified, making a permanent federal income tax constitutionally valid and removing the legal obstacles that had blocked similar attempts in previous decades. And the 17th Amendment was ratified, shifting the election of United States senators from state legislatures to direct popular vote. 3 changes. 1 year. Each one carrying a clear public justification. Each one lasting, in its essential form, to the present day. At first, it seems normal to view these as separate legislative events that happen to cluster in the same period. Political reform movements do not always move at an even pace. Sometimes conditions align and multiple changes arrive together. That explanation is not unreasonable, but there is a problem with leaving it there. When changes of this scale arrive together, and when each one moves in the same general direction, toward greater central authority, toward more concentrated federal power, the explanation of simple coincidence becomes harder to accept without further examination. Not impossible, but harder. Each change came with a rationale that was publicly acceptable and, in many cases, genuinely compelling. The Federal Reserve was presented as a solution to the recurring financial panics that had destabilized the American economy multiple times in the preceding decades. The income tax was presented as a fair way to ensure that the wealthiest Americans contributed to public expenses at a rate proportional to their means. The direct election of senators was presented as a democratic reform that would reduce corruption and give ordinary citizens more direct influence over their government. These justifications were not invented from thin air. Real problems existed. Real grievances motivated real people. And real political energy was behind each of these changes. But questions remain, and they are not small ones. The Federal Reserve was conceived in private, at a meeting attended by representatives of the largest banking interests in the country, held in a location chosen specifically for its remoteness, with participants traveling under conditions designed to prevent public identification. Whatever the final legislation looked like when it reached Congress, its foundations were laid in secret by the very industry it was meant to regulate. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Public financial policy shaped in private by private financial interests is not a small matter. It is a question about whose purposes that policy was ultimately designed to serve. The income tax raises a different kind of question. When it was introduced, it was described and defended as a measure that would primarily affect the very wealthy. The initial rates were low. The threshold above which income became taxable was set high enough that the vast majority of working Americans would not be touched by it. That framing helped secure public support. It also helped address concerns that a broad tax on ordinary wages would be politically unacceptable. But the history of what followed is not what that framing suggested. Over the following decades, the income tax expanded. Rates rose. Thresholds fell. What began as a tax on concentrated wealth eventually became a tax on nearly every working person in the country. Whether that expansion was the inevitable result of government fiscal needs, or whether it was always the intended destination, is a question that does not have a clean answer in the available record. The 17th Amendment follows a similar pattern of stated purpose and complicated outcome. The argument for direct election of senators rested heavily on the corruption of the existing system. State legislatures, it was argued, were too easily influenced by wealthy local interests who could buy Senate seats through political pressure and financial support. Removing that system in favor of popular elections would, the argument went, make senators more accountable to the people. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because accountability did shift, but not necessarily in the direction the reform promised. A senator answering to the general public still needs resources to communicate with voters, to run campaigns, to maintain visibility. Those resources come from somewhere, and the question of whether moving from state legislative appointment to mass popular election actually reduced the influence of concentrated wealth, or simply changed how that influence was applied, remains genuinely open. There's also the question of what 1913 has come to represent in the historical imagination, or more precisely, what it has not come to represent. For a year that contained changes of such lasting significance, it receives surprisingly little attention in how American history is typically taught and remembered. It tends to appear, when it appears at all, as a background detail, a list of legislative events that preceded the more dramatic story of the First World War. The war arrived the following year, and its scale and horror naturally drew historical attention. The institutional changes that had just been made to American domestic governance were, in that context, easy to pass over quickly. But the fact that 1913 receded into the background so rapidly is itself something worth noticing. Consequential years tend to be remembered. The quietness of 1913 in popular historical memory is an unusual feature of an unusually significant moment. Some researchers have noted that this relative invisibility has practical effects. When a major structural change in how government operates is not widely understood by the public, it becomes harder for the public to evaluate whether that structure is working as intended. The Federal Reserve makes decisions that affect the price of every good purchased and every loan taken in the American economy. But its internal deliberations are not subject to the same transparency requirements as most government institutions. The income tax shapes the financial life of nearly every working person in the country. But the complexity of the tax code makes it difficult for most people to fully understand how it operates and in whose interests it has been shaped. The direct election of senators was meant to increase democratic accountability, but the cost of modern Senate campaigns has grown to a scale that raises its own questions about whose interests candidates are actually serving once elected. These are not fringe observations. They are raised regularly by economists, legal scholars, historians, and political scientists across a wide range of perspectives and institutional affiliations. The questions do not belong to one political tradition or one school of thought. They emerge from sustained, serious engagement with documented history, and they have not been answered in ways that have fully satisfied the people asking them. That persistent dissatisfaction is itself a data point. It suggests that the official explanations, while not without merit, have left enough unresolved to keep serious inquiry alive. And this is where the examination of 1913 leads to something broader than the specific details of any single amendment or institution. It leads to a question about how major structural changes happen in general, whether they emerge primarily from public pressure and democratic process, whether they emerge primarily from the strategic action of concentrated private interests working through public channels, or whether the reality is some complicated mixture of both, where genuine popular energy and more calculated elite influence are difficult to fully separate from each other. The events of 1913 do not answer that question definitively, but they provide one of the most studied and most debated examples of how it plays out in practice. The Jekyll Island meeting sits in the record as a documented fact. A secret gathering of financial and political figures produced a blueprint for what became the Federal Reserve. That is established. What remains unclear is the precise nature of the intentions behind it, and the degree to which those intentions shaped the final outcome. Old letters and archived documents from the figures involved offer some insight, but they do not offer full transparency. People who are aware that their correspondence may eventually become historical evidence do not always write candidly. The gap between what was said in private and what was recorded for posterity is a gap that historians work around but cannot fully close. What 1913 ultimately demonstrates, perhaps more clearly than any single interpretation can capture, is that large institutional changes carry consequences that extend far beyond what is visible at the moment of their creation. The people who designed the Federal Reserve, whether acting in good faith or not, could not have fully anticipated how it would function across a century of economic change. The people who supported the income tax, whatever their motivations, could not have fully predicted the form it would take after decades of expansion and revision. The people who argued for the 17th Amendment could not have known exactly how the relationship between senators and financial influence would evolve in the age of mass media and expensive national campaigns. Intentions, even when clearly held, do not determine outcomes. Structures, once built, develop their own logic. Whether the year 1913 was the result of deliberate coordination by a small number of powerful figures, or the result of converging democratic pressures that happened to produce similar outcomes, or some combination of both, that remains genuinely unclear. The evidence does not resolve the question. It illuminates it from different angles, without settling it. And that may be the most honest thing that can be said about it. Not that the truth is unknowable, but that it has not yet been fully known. The documents that would clarify the remaining uncertainties may exist somewhere in archives that have not been fully examined. They may have been lost. They may never have been written down. What continues is the question itself. Why did so much change so quickly, so quietly, in a single year? Why do the changes of 1913 receive so little attention relative to their apparent significance? Why have serious researchers, working for decades after the fact, continue to find the mainstream explanations incomplete? These are not questions that lead to comfortable answers, but they are questions that keep returning, not because people are drawn to suspicion for its own sake, but because the gap between what is officially explained and what is fully understood remains wide enough to keep the inquiry open. And in history, as in most things, it is usually the questions that will not stay closed that deserve the most careful attention.